Chapter 4 8 years later. Snow White slowly cleaned the floor around the scullery with a worn mop. It was a futile task. Then suddenly, somewhere down the hall, a large crash disturbed her peace. "Hello?" she called out, leaning on her mop, but no one answered. Setting down all her cleaning supplies, Snow White walked carefully and silently down the hall, determined to investigate. Peeking around the corner into the kitchen, she found a young man filling a sack with potatoes. "I'm sorry. Is there something I can help you with?" she questioned. "Oh, that's okay, just browsing," he answered. "I'm going to have to ask you to put those back," she said. "You know, I would, but it looks like the Queen has plenty already," he informed her. Snow White was taken off guard. "Oh, I see. So that's your excuse for stealing?" she asked. "No," he said. "Actually, my friends are hungry. I'm hungry. That's my excuse." Snow White felt her resolve begin to soften. There were a lot of people going hungry in the kingdom. "Maybe I could speak to the Queen," she said. But the man just scoffed. "You think any of those people upstairs would share a crumb with people like us?" She felt herself becoming defensive. She would have, of course, and so would her father. The people of their kingdom were of utmost importance to them. She decided to speak her truth. "The princess would." "Snow White?" The man looked at her with a skeptical eye. "No one's seen or heard from Snow White in years. I doubt she's going to be much help to anyone." Feeling flustered, Snow White interrupted him. "All she does is think of how to help her people." "Well," he said, "you should let her know, at some point. It might be useful for her to stop thinking and maybe start doing." But the conversation was interrupted as the Queen's huntsman appeared down the hall and gave orders to the guards. "Seal the doors. There's an intruder in the castle." The man offered Snow White some food. "Take some for yourself. You can give the rest to your princess." With that, he hurried out, leaving Snow White alone and shaken by his words. Nervously, Snow White ran her hands along the rough fabric of her dress. The simple garment was faded from wear. The small flowers that had once been bright red were now a dull pink. When she was younger, it had swallowed her thin, girlish frame. But now, at 18, she had grown out of it. The skirt was too short for her long legs, and the bodice was tight at her waist. A blue and white checkered apron did little to cover the various stains. She didn't dare complain, though. She was lucky even to have the dress. Her stepmother did not like giving anything to anyone. She swallowed. The thought brought her right back to the very thing that had been on her mind: how to ask the Queen for a gift. She had been practicing the request for days, more and more frantically as her birthday approached. Now, taking a deep breath, she tried the speech out one more time. Holding her broom in front of her, she spoke to the 3 birds and a squirrel who seemed to be offering squeaks and chirps of skepticism. "Well, I at least have to try," she told them. "Maybe no one else has even told her. If the Queen had any idea how desperate things have gotten, I'm sure she would be happy to share." But the animals voiced their dubiousness, which caused Snow White to laugh. "You can't be sure of anything, I suppose. But even so, I believe that she'll listen to me." She turned and moved toward the wishing well. Peering at the water, she saw her reflection staring back at her. Her hair was still short. The Queen had demanded it stay that way. Her cheeks were flushed from her speech rehearsal, but her dark eyes, which once upon a time had twinkled, were flat. "I am still the Princess Snow White," she said to the water. "Snow White," the well echoed. "Even if you're the only one who can remember," she said. The well said her word back to her. "Remember." Snow White shook her head, and she knew she was being childish. She was 18, and talking to herself was something she had done when she was younger, desperate for companionship. But old habits were hard to break. She needed someone to talk to, even if it was, technically, herself. It was time to see the Queen. The woman expected a daily check-in, after all. Snow White would use it as her excuse to bring up her request. Maybe. Making her way through the halls toward the dining room, she said hello to the few servants and guards left in the castle. Even though it had been 8 years since her father had left, it was still a shock to see the castle so empty, so lifeless. Snow White arrived at the doors to the dining room. She hesitated. What would happen if she didn't go in? What if she just went to her chambers? What could the queen do? Make her life more miserable? She sighed. She had the same thought every day, and every day she pushed it aside in the hope that this time, when she walked in, the queen would welcome her with kindness. It hadn't happened yet, but Snow White was nothing if not optimistic. Entering the room, she paused to look at the long, ornate table. As always, it was covered with far more food than the queen would ever eat. Beautiful flowers were arranged in the center, and the finest cutlery had been laid out. Such a waste, Snow White thought as she approached her stepmother. There's no one to impress. Snow White, the woman said, not looking up from her plate. A nervous servant shuffled in and refilled her glass. Then Crab walked quickly away. Have you finished your chores? Yes, Your Majesty, Snow White stuttered. It's important we all do our share, the queen replied. As she spoke, she lifted a pearl spoon from beside her plate and dipped it into a crystal cup of caviar. She brought it to her mouth, a faint sneer on her lips as she devoured the delicacy. Snow White took a breath. It was now or never. That's what I came to speak to you about, she said, her tongue tripping. Sharing. The queen's spoon slowly lowered to the table. Her eyebrows shot up. Then, with a snap of the queen's fingers, a servant appeared with a chair and placed it right next to the queen. Nervously, Snow White sat. The queen took a pair of silver pliers and cracked open a lobster claw. Snow White cringed. Was she imagining it? Or did the queen seem to relish the violent breaking? Please, you were saying? Snow White's fingers itched to hold her locket, which was always around her neck. It brought her strength, and she needed that now. But she didn't dare. The queen despised the trinket, like she despised anything else that had to do with life before. Squaring her shoulders, Snow White mustered up her courage. Your Majesty, she began, taking a deep breath. People are struggling, and it may not be much, but when I was young, my parents and I would pick apples, and we'd take them and make pies, and we'd go out into the village and... Her rushed words were stopped by the way the queen peered closely at her. Pies? Pies are luxuries. They don't need luxuries. It confuses them. The queen picked up her crackers and began to work on another lobster claw. Snow White shook her head. She didn't believe that. She didn't think pies were a luxury. A memory flashed in her mind, a wisp of a scent of freshly baked dough and sweet apples. It made her chest ache. She had to make the queen understand. But sometimes something small, something sweet even, can make you remember that there is more to being alive than mere subsistence. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. For a moment, both women sat, surprised by what Snow White had said. The truth she had pointed out, the implication she had made, that the queen didn't know everything. Then the queen shook her head, and her face grew stony. You know, she snarled, I really don't remember you being this opinionated. Snow White looked down at her lap, where her finger traced one of the faded flowers. This was not going as planned. My apologies, she whispered. It's just I feel they need some kindness. Suddenly, the queen froze. Her eyes widened as she took Snow White's chin in her hand and moved her face to catch the light that fell from one of the high windows that surrounded the room. The light that reflected Snow White's inner grace and elegance and highlighted the clear, pure beauty beneath the smudges and rags. Is something wrong, Your Majesty? Snow White asked when the woman continued to stare at her. It was making her even more nervous than she had been before. The queen released Snow White's face and slowly pulled the heart necklace up from around her neck. Fearless, fair, brave, true, she read. How quaint. But there was something in her voice, something that made her sound uncertain. Snow White had never heard it before. But as quickly as the moment had come, it passed. Lifting her chin and dropping the necklace, the queen reached her hands out to Snow White, who reluctantly laid hers on top. Maybe if your father returns, he could share more of his wisdom. Getting to her feet, she gestured for Snow White to do the same. Then, taking her by the arm, she led her toward the door. But in the meantime, there's a tippet for you. Observe. She took a rose out of a vase that stood near the door, and she began to twist it in her long, thin fingers. Ravishing, isn't it? Snow White wasn't sure what the queen was talking about, herself or the rose. But she nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. Before she could finish, the queen turned her hand, and Snow White saw a flash of its back before the queen flipped it over again. The queen was holding a walnut-sized diamond between her fingers. She lifted it to Snow White's face. One is weak, useless, fragile, pretty, she whispered harshly. The other hard, unyielding, flawless, everlasting. In short, beautiful. The flower dangled from her left hand as she held the diamond in her right. Snow White looked back and forth between them, trying to figure out what the queen was getting at with her little show and tell. My subjects don't want a flower, she snarled. They want a diamond. Slowly the rose in the queen's hand crumbled away to dust. Snow White opened her mouth and then closed it again. She had a very good feeling who the queen thought was the flower, and she certainly didn't want to be destroyed. She moved to leave, but before she could open the door, it swung inward. Dragging a scruffy young man by the collar of his shirt, the huntsman entered. Snow White shivered. The huntsman had once been her father's right-hand man. Now he was the queen's lackey. And the man he was dragging was the same one Snow White had seen in the pantry. Despite the danger he was clearly in, Snow White saw a twinkle in his eye. He looked back and forth between the women, reading the energy in the room, and finding it lacking for anything other than drama. The huntsman cuffed him on the back of the head to silence him and then turned to the queen. Your Highness, this criminal was caught in the scullery pilfering royal supplies. The queen, however, was less than impressed with the look of the man before her. Are you one of the bandits that gathered in the forest, stealing in the name of the king? In the mention of her father, Snow White's breath caught. If these bandits were stealing for him, did that mean they thought he was alive? Was he alive? The thief shook his head. No, Your Majesty, he said. Not one of the bandits. I'm the boss, loyal to the one true king. The queen had had enough. Snow White saw a dangerous glint in her eye, and then she spoke, her words directed at the huntsman. Find his home and burn it to the ground. Her demand did not have the deserted effect. Funny thing is, the young man said, his face a picture of innocence, I don't actually have a home. Snow White bit the inside of her lip as she saw a look of exasperation cross the queen's face. This thief was far braver than she would have given him credit for. Or perhaps he was far more foolish. Talking back to the queen was something no one did ever. Then take him to the dungeon, she snarled. Fill the castle with his cries. For the first time since he had been dragged into the chamber, the thief seemed to falter. Snow White saw fear flash in his eyes, and she knew that the queen's threat was anything but idle. No one ever returned from the dungeon. Taking a deep breath, she rubbed a finger over her locket. Brave. True. Your Majesty, she began. I understand the need for justice, but please, this isn't fair. The queen's eyebrow arched skyward. What did you say? She asked. Snow White was beginning to regret her decision to speak up, but she couldn't stop now. The punishment must not exceed the crime, and I know my father would. She stopped, realizing what a mistake she had just made. Your father would what? The queen said, her voice oozing with anger. The thief looked back and forth between Snow White and the queen, his expression curious. Your father? He echoed. My father would show mercy, Snow White answered, her voice barely a whisper. For a long moment, the room was quiet. Snow White held her breath, waiting for the storm to be unleashed. But to her shock, the queen nodded. I'm sorry, my dear, she said, the picture of calm. You're right. This thief stole from me, so I will steal from him. She turned to the huntsman. Remove his coat and boots and bind him to the gates to freeze. I'll make an example for all to see. The young man gulped. Is the dungeon still an option? Take him away, the queen said in answer. Snow White watched helplessly as the huntsman began to drag the young man from the room. As the young man passed by her, his eyes met hers with a hardness that blamed her for everything. A moment later, he was pulled through the door and had slammed behind him. Snow White stared at the door. She had just been trying to help, and she had made a mess of things. But your majesty, she said, turning to the queen. The calm facade had been dropped. The queen's eyes were dark pools of rage as she picked up her scepter, and when she spoke, her voice was icy. I tried, she said. I took the time to school you, to teach you my truth. Did you even listen? She stopped. Here. The queen grabbed Snow White's arm and shoved the scepter into her hand. Roughly, she spun Snow White around so she was facing one of the many mirrors in the room. Look at yourself, she hissed. Isn't this what you want? Go on, speak to your people. Snow White didn't know what to do or what to say. The look of hatred in the queen's eyes had rendered her speechless. She hadn't meant to make her mad. She was just trying to do the right thing. And what had the queen meant when she'd said she had tried to show the queen's truth? She had barely spoken to Snow White in the nearly 10 years she had lived in the castle. As Snow White looked up, her eyes met the queen's in the mirror, and any last shred of confidence she had faded away. The queen looked every inch the strong, beautiful ruler, and there was Snow White, in her rags, her hands shaking around the scepter. Your subjects await you, Snow White, the queen said, torturing her with her words. Your pies and your wise words. What will you tell them? That you've made them dessert? Her voice was curt, dismissive, and it wounded like the sharpest blade. You live in a world of wishes. Her message delivered. The queen grabbed her scepter and stormed out of the room. Snow White stood, frozen, long after the queen had left. While she couldn't make her body move, her mind raced over the words hurled her way. Was the queen right? Was she only wishes and nothing more? Her father had taught her to be true to herself, to have courage and use her voice. But the first time she had been challenged to do so, she had failed. Would she ever be the girl her father wanted her to be? The girl she was meant to be? Or would she only ever be an echo of that girl? Taking a deep breath, Snow White moved toward the door. She was tired of being a shadow inside the castle walls. She wanted to do something, be braver, more like the thief. She startled, remembering his look as he had been dragged from the room. She had to make things right with him. But first, she had a stop to make.